Sorry if you've been up and down and mucked about, Mr. Dodds.
Lady Member called Diane Dodds.
Just face down and hold that in your right hand and repeat the words after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
You may take a seat.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Would you provide your full name, please?
Diane Dodds.
And I understand, Lady Dodds, that is your formal title, Lady Dodds, but your
Yes.
preference is that you use the term Mrs. Dodds. That's customary for your political background?
Yes, in my work environment, yes. Thank you.
Thank you for assisting the inquiry. Can I ask you to keep your voice up, speak into the microphone? It may be that one of us goes too quickly, in which case we'll need to slow down the pace. You have provided a witness statement dated the 13th of March 2024. That's at INQ 000436924. Your signature in the statement of truth is at page 46. Please can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true?
Yes, they are.
And you're content to rely upon the statement and evidence of the inquiry?
I am.
If I could just summarise your political career very briefly. So you were elected as a Democratic Unionist MLA for West Belfast in 2003. You held a position as a Democratic Unionist councillor in Belfast City Council in 2005. You were elected as a Democratic Unionist member of the European Parliament in 2009. And then you were co-opted to the Northern Ireland Assembly as a Democratic Unionist MLA on the 11th of January 2020. Is that correct?
That is correct. Thank you.
And relevantly to the inquiry, you were appointed as Minister for the Economy from the 11th of January 2020 to the 13th of June 2021. Is that also correct?
That is correct.
Your statement sets out the responsibilities of the Department for the Economy, so I won't propose to deal with that here. If I could just deal firstly with funding of Northern Ireland. Is it correct that Northern Ireland's predominantly funded through the block grant?
It is. Northern Ireland gets an allocation from the block grant. This year it is around 14.5 billion, and that funds public services, education.
And the main part of the block grant is what's called a Barnett consequential. So it's about 3% of what Westminster spends is then provided to Northern Ireland. Is that right?
Yes. Well, Barnett consequentials come to Northern Ireland on foot of decisions made primarily on new policy for England and Wales, and therefore Northern Ireland gets a consequential amount of funding in relation to that, as well as the block grant.
Thank you. And Northern Ireland's able to spend those consequentials exactly how it wishes. Is that right?
Sometimes those consequentials can be ring-fenced or identified for a particular purpose, but mostly they can be used in whatever way the Northern Ireland Executive wants to use them.
You say in your statement that the Assembly was never going to be able to provide the enormous amounts of funding required in order to fund the response to the pandemic. So is it right that effectively Northern Ireland couldn't have funded the response without the additional funding from the United Kingdom government?
No, I actually, first of all, don't think that any devolved regional assembly could have actually funded the response to the COVID pandemic in the way that it was done. So Northern Ireland very much relied upon the furlough scheme, the self-employed scheme, the bounce-back loans, the kind of measures that were put there nationally. But in addition to that, we then developed schemes of our own to support the economy here. And an interesting, probably aside for the inquiry to consider, is that in the Northern Ireland Audit Office has done a series of reports on the Executive's response to the pandemic, mainly outlining the financial and the schemes and so on. And in the second Northern Ireland Audit Office report, and I apologise, I should have added this as information and can add it as an addendum if you so wish. In the second Audit Office report, by the end of March 21, Northern Ireland, the pandemic, about 6.2 billion had been spent additional to the block grant in Northern Ireland.
If I can just break down some of those figures.
Yes.
So by the 19th of March 2020, there was over £900 million available through Barnett consequentials. Does that sound about right?
No, by the Northern Ireland Audit Office report indicates that of that 6.2 billion, around 3.9 billion was direct action in relation to the economy and wider services, so vulnerable people, etc., etc. And 3.3 billion of that was from Barnett consequentials.
I think we're talking about two slightly different time frames.
Oh, sorry.
So by the 19th of March 2020...
Oh, 2020, sorry. I'm in 2021, I've raced ahead, I apologise.
That's absolutely fine, because we have so David Sterling indicated that the Northern Ireland Audit Office had confirmed by 24th of July 2020, 2.2 billion had been provided. So you can see it actually starts quite high, and then the numbers increase over the lifetime of the pandemic. Yes. And you also then say in your statement that officials have been looking at whether there's any funds to mitigate the impact of the pandemic, and that with the benefit of hindsight, that there were actions, for example, PPE and scaling up testing could have been planned a lot earlier, but that would have required vast sums of money. Would you be able to expand upon what, with the benefit of hindsight, the additional preparations you think should have been?
Well, I think that as we went through the late January, February period in relation to that preparation period, we will have known, and the Department of Health will have known, that we will have a great need for some of these things. And on the 12th of March, if I can recall accurately, the department took a decision, the Department of Health, to stop testing. And I do believe that that was in part because there were not enough tests to actually facilitate the mass testing that we might have otherwise concluded. Now, we have some amazing pharmaceutical companies in Northern Ireland, and those pharmaceutical companies developed tests as the pandemic went on, had a very large role in testing across the whole of the United Kingdom. But it was partly capacity, planning and finance.
Yes, thank you. In terms of planning, as you say there, just picking the thread still of the Barnett consequentials, was there sufficient clarity to your department or the Department of Finance about both the amounts and the dates on which there would be the payment of the Barnett consequentials, which would then allow the Northern Ireland government to plan its response?
So if we're talking about the early part of the pandemic, I don't think that, and of course you will have to ask the Department of Finance this in their evidence, that I recall and I have reviewed some of the executive papers, that in the executive paper of the 16th of March, one of the agreements was that departments would look in their own budgets where there would be additional funding that they could use in the response to the pandemic. But of course, it was never going to be possible to have enough money within those budgets to have the enormous response that was required. And I think really the announcement of furlough on the 20th of March, which was then backdated to the 1st of March, that first national scheme and some of the additional funding that started to come then was one of the first times that we could see a way within the economy to financially support firms and companies and individuals.
Carrying on with furlough, we know that it was extended on at least 2 occasions in the autumn and in the winter of 2020. To what extent did the knowledge of whether furlough was going to be extended have any impact upon the ability of the Northern Ireland government to plan its own spending arising from those additional one-off consequentials?
Oh, I think that had a really significant impact on how you plan and how you mitigate in terms of the pandemic. If we think of September 2020, in September 2020, furlough was reduced to 70% of hours not worked. By October, furlough was to be reduced to 60% of hours not worked. Now, that actually meant that there was a real fear that we would add huge numbers more to the unemployment register because firms could not continue to either make up the additional amount of money because they weren't operating at full value, or that firms would just simply say, we can't do any more, that's what we do. And I'll cite you one particular example, which I think is quite important. Aerospace in Northern Ireland is a huge and very prestigious industry for Northern Ireland. And of course, aerospace was absolutely devastated by that. And Bombardier announced 600 job losses in June, and the impact was in September when those redundancies came out.
So on that reduction, would the Northern Ireland government have been able to fund the gap?
No.
Thank you. If I can then move back into early 2020, so what did you consider was the role of the executive prior to the activation of the civil contingencies arrangements on the 16th of March?
So in the early part of 2020, I think there had been a decision where the Department of Health was leading on the planning and on all of the issues around the pandemic. I think TEO have a coordinating role within the government in Northern Ireland. And I think, if I recall a paper rightly, the Department of Justice was to look at how we would deal with issues around excess deaths and how we would manage things as well. So we had three departments that were looking at different aspects of the pandemic. And of course, in our own department, we were looking at, the likely impacts. By the beginning of March, we were already beginning to see quite a significant number of layoffs.
Yes, but in relation to the question, which was what was the role of the executive prior to the activation of NICMA, please could you explain what you understood the role of the executive committee as a body to be prior to the 16th of March?
Well, I think should have been stood up at the request of the Health Minister to the First and Deputy First Minister, and therefore the contingency arrangements would have been stood up in full, and that could have happened when it was deemed necessary to do it.
So are you saying it should have been stood up earlier?
No, I'm saying that's the process that
Right.
it should have been stood up. Or that's the process by. I think there are probably very good reasons that it may have been stood up earlier. I think that we, as an executive committee, throughout February probably had not so much information from the Department of Health around the planning for the pandemic. And I recall the meeting of the 2nd of March where we had a very significant discussion in relation to that.
Thank you. If I can move to the planning within your individual department prior to the 16th of March. If we could have INQ 000 213 585, and this is a economic impact assessment provided by your department, dated the 10th of March 2020. It's right that the Department for the Economy had stood up its own operations centre on the 26th of February 2020. So it was engaged, certainly in the early part of March, in planning and had been for a couple of weeks. And then, so this document was provided. If we can go to the bottom of page 3, please. And so we can see at the bottom paragraph, at the time of writing the government's reasonable worst case scenario planning assumptions. And then the department has actually assessed that against the Northern Ireland's growth at that time. If I can then move on, please, to page 6 and the last paragraph. And again, it's providing the conclusion. That paper seems to be setting out what the impact is likely to be, but it doesn't actually say what the department is likely to do about it. Are you aware of what planning arose subsequent to this assessment on the 10th of March?
Planning really began quite significantly after that, and particularly when furlough was announced. That really was a game changer in relation to protecting jobs and firms and the economy. And then after that, we were able to avail of significant funds that came from London, and we started to initiate the localised schemes which would start to sort of alleviate or mitigate the impact of the pandemic on individuals and businesses.
You've actually slightly jumped ahead of me. If we could have INQ at 86935. This is a document that's been shown a number of times, and happily the economy is the first page here. So if we can just scroll down to page 2, please, and then we'll come back to page 1. So we can see in further education, for example, that in the central column, potential impacts, we have, it's talking about disruption, potential costs to support others, and impact upon those. So that was what was assessed against a further education. If we can just go back to page 1, please. And that we can see that in relation to the top line, economy, business, that those impacts aren't identified. Do you think that the reason why those impacts aren't identified in relation to economy, business is, as you said, that the funding position about what would the response be able to be at that point?
I'm not sure in a sense, because this was officials drawing up their list at that time, and we changed this as time went on. We worked very hard at providing economic impacts to the executive and so on. So we knew that if there is a pandemic, if people cannot work, if people are ill, if businesses close down, then obviously there is going to be increased unemployment. And in actual fact, by the end of April 2020, we had doubled the number of unemployed in Northern Ireland. So it was a really significant, difficult first hit at the economy in relation to that. We were also really concerned that new and developing businesses like the creative industries couldn't operate. And if I could just point out another sector of the economy
Mrs.
that
Dodds, apologies to cut across you, but it would be beneficial. There'll be opportunity to have a look at some of those papers. Yeah. If I can ask you to focus on the documents that I'm showing you, the questions that are being asked. You said that this is a document that's been prepared by officials.
Yep.
Had you seen this or seen what any plans were about how to support the economy as of the 13th of March 2020?
I could not tell you whether I saw it of the 13th of March 2020, but across the course of the pandemic, I saw many iterations of this kind of scenario planning.
Thank you. If I can just take you to, it's the handwritten notes of the executive meeting of the 15th of April. So it's INQ 4065735, and it's at page 16. And this is about so if we can then go over the page, please. So we can see there's a discussion about the regulations, and then there's DFE. Whenever we see those, then that's a reference to yourself, and that's to be distinguished from DE, which would be the Education Minister. And we can see that you've identified there the potential economic impact. If we can then just go over to page 18, and you have the opening line of the DOH, so that would be the Health Minister, is economic challenge, my focus is health.
Yeah.
Do you feel like there was a sufficiently effective working relationship between yourself and the Health Minister, or the Department for the Economy and the Department of Health, about responding to the pandemic, both as a public health and as an economic matter?
The pandemic was primarily a health challenge, and the focus of the executive was always on the issue of how to save life and minimise the issues for families and so on, and in that. But the wider ramifications of the pandemic and the economic downturn that it caused, the challenge to families, to, vulnerable workers, to people on zero-hour contracts, those were very, very real. And I suppose the challenge in all of this was to take the health advice, but also try to look at the issue in a rounded way by looking at all of the people who were impacted by the pandemic. And I noticed in the Health Minister's submission where he talks about this in his evidence to the inquiry, and he actually talks about this, and he says, that at times we. And he mentions me by name as saying, a strong advocate for the economy. But those two, health and the economy, were not, and this is his words, not mine, a consistent tension within the executive. And it didn't stop decisions being made and being reached. But it was important to have a rounded picture of what was happening to all sections of our society.
And that's what I wanted to ask you about. If we can go to page 20, is that you say at the second entry there, very useful if Department for the Economy officials could be involved. And then the CMO says economist and DOH reaching out to DFE officials. Do you actually think that there was that cohesive relationship, not just in terms of approach to the economic and public health maintenance, but actually a working relationship between the two departments? Or was there a bit of distance between the two?
In the nature of government in Northern Ireland is that it is quite siloed. So ministers have legal responsibility within their own department. They are responsible for the operational issues in their department. And the central office of First and Deputy First Minister, or TEO, comes in that coordinating role in bringing things together or in cross-cutting issues. So, for example, the strategy for against women and girls against violence is held in TEO because it's a cross-cutting strategy that reaches across all of the departments in Northern Ireland. So there is always this kind of healthy tension around departments. And I don't say that just in the case of the pandemic. I think that is the case across departments. But I don't think that it stops departments working together. But sometimes officials can be quite, and ministers, precious about their own department.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, because the cross-cutting structures are intended to bring the ministers together. But does the individual responsibility of a minister to their department have the impact that when it's not a cross-cutting measure, that then actually drives the department slightly apart?
Except when those issues are deemed to be significant, cross-cutting,
yes,
or controversial.
Yes. Thank you. We can see, again, this CMOs there was talking about the economists. Should the executive committee have had access to expert advice, something akin to the CMO or the CSA, to advise as to the economic impact of measures that were taken to respond to the pandemic?
Well, it's only the wider executive could actually really respond to that. But in terms of what we were doing in the Department of the Economy, we had various number of stakeholder groups, and those stakeholder groups comprised of people who were very eminent in business and the economy in Northern Ireland. So I had my economic advisory panel. That economic advisory panel was chaired by the former head of Ulster Bank in Northern Ireland. So they were very significant people within the economy.
They weren't in the executive.
No, they weren't.
Providing advice.
They were advising and inputting into the things that we were doing, which were then going to the executive.
But do you think that it would have been beneficial, either to yourself as the Economy Minister or to the wider executive, that there would have been those voices in the executive committee or providing their own advice?
They may have been, and that might have been seen less as a departmental issue and more as a cross-cutting issue. But I am content that within my department that we had significant recourse to very, very expert advice in terms of the economy.
Moving on to a slightly different element of the overall response to the pandemic, and that is the consideration of equalities. Do you consider that sufficient consideration was given to the potential impact upon those who'd be most disadvantaged by the response to the pandemic? And when I say that, sufficient consideration within the planning conducted by your own department?
I think that we tried to respond to the pandemic with very, very significant haste. So in the initial phase, when it was confirmed, for example, that we had significant funding within, and probably the first regional devolved administration in the United Kingdom, we had our 10 grant scheme out for local businesses within the categories that applied. So we tried to respond very quickly. Do I think that overall, either in my department, in my department we produced schemes, we tried to enact them, and where there were, when we reviewed those schemes, we reviewed them in light of our Section 75 obligations. But I don't think, and I think that there is a learning in this for the future, in that I do think that the issues for me of young students with mental health issues, and even though we provided very, very significant funds to universities, they were hard to reach, and it was more difficult for universities to do that. College students, we provided laptops. We had all sorts of schemes to try to help them to learn and work at home. But I think that taking away that social environment and so on was very, very difficult for young people. And again, if I may say so, I think also the impact of the pandemic in terms of the economy was very unequal. So we have a large public sector in Northern Ireland that pretty much carried on.
Can I just pause the public sector element, because you were talking about colleges, you were talking about the impact upon those attending colleges. There's one document I'd like to take you to, because one of the Department for Economy's responsibilities is further education. Thank you. So just for reference, this is INQ 000 212403.
Before you ask the question, I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Scott. What did you say the learning was? That the people you then talked about, the students with mental health issues, that you should have paid the executive should have paid greater attention to them at the beginning. You talked about there being a learning. I'm sorry, I didn't quite.
I think the learning is that we need to place more emphasis on things that maybe we were so concerned with the transmission of the virus that we also need to place more emphasis on things that we may not have seen as central to what we had to do to save lives.
So place more emphasis on the wider impact.
Yes.
And in order to do that, I think you probably need to accurately recognise when there's likely to be an impact upon groups. Is that a fair suggestion?
Sorry, if you could repeat that.
In order to be able to do that, you probably need to be able to accurately recognise as a department when there is an impact upon either a Section 75 group or somebody who doesn't fall within the Section 75 group. Is that right? So This policy that's on the screen, if we can just scroll down a fraction just to show the date. So this is the 26th of February 2020, so it was the day that the Departmental Operating Centre had opened. And this is about the power to close further education colleges and higher education institutions. Apologies. If we can go down to page 6. And it sets out the background, and as it's trying to achieve is to prevent and control the outbreak of Covid-19. And if we can then go to page 7, please. And again, that confirms that's the Department for the Economy's policy. I'd just like to just go down to page 12, because you have a number of the Section 75 groups. One of them is age, for example. And then we can see there that it's broken down by age. And then if we just scroll to page 15, again, the statistics set out about disability. You can see there's the impacts of disability, not disabled. So there's a lot of information there within this policy about what the makeup was of those who were students at a further education or higher education college. If we can go to page, I think, 19 first, please. So it can see, again, there that the closure is potentially impacting across the entire student population.
Yes.
And effectively, it's the same wording apart from the last clause, which is relating back. If we can go to page 26. And we can see there, for example, disability. Now, the right-hand column is the assessment of the department about the equality implications. All of the equality implications for all of these groups are marked as none, as the impact would be the same across all Section 75 groupings. Is it right that the Department for the Economy can have recognised that there would be no equality impact upon any Section 75 group from the closing of higher education colleges or further education colleges?
I don't think it's actually saying that. What I think it's actually saying is that the impact is the same as it would have been across all Section 75. I mean, and I'm not sure why it was written in that way. I think everyone understood.
I don't want to be unfair. If I can show you the conclusion at page 34. Okay. So, given the decision to close or temporarily redirect does not indicate any disproportionate impacts on any Section 75 grouping.
Oh, right, okay. Well, I'm genuinely not sure why that was written in that way. I think anyone knows and understands, and particularly in further education colleges, where we have a very significant group of very vulnerable young adults who go to further education colleges, that closing those education colleges will have a significant impact. Now, I do think, and this was a very, very early draft of a document, I do think that as the pandemic went on, we realised and knew how difficult that this was for some of those young people, many of them with particular special educational needs and a range of difficulties. And it was also difficult for their parents who had no respite and were afraid that those young people could go out with the virus. So it's an early document. I'm not trying to excuse the writing of it at all in any shape or form, but I do think as time went on, I am desperately conscious of how the pandemic impacted those people.
The purpose of my next question is actually about the development of the department's understanding and identification. Are you able to identify the development from within the department to access and understand those people who may be impacted upon the decisions that the department was taking or the decisions that the executive was taking as a whole?
I am. In as much as we produced a very wide range of papers about the impact of COVID on various sections of our society. And when I talk about the impact of COVID in sections of our society, it is about the impact on young people who lose their jobs, young apprentices who are in maybe the second year of their apprenticeship who cannot continue. It is about the people on 0 hours contracts who find themselves unemployed and in very significant financial difficulties. And that is, I think, the impact of COVID in its widest sense. In many ways, as I was saying, the impact of COVID on the economy was unequal. We have a very large public sector in Northern Ireland, which continued pretty much as it was, and we have some really our heroes within that public sector. Nurses
again,
and
apologies,
doctors.
Mrs. Dodds. If you could please focus on the question. I will be coming back to the impact upon the public sector. The question was how the department improved its understanding of those, like all those groups you identified who could be impacted, how it improved its understanding of the impact upon those groups as the pandemic developed.
Right. So, for example, in terms of young people, young apprentices, we developed our apprenticeship scheme, and around 19 million pounds went to an apprenticeship scheme to try to bring and keep young people in the workplace, because many of those young people, one, their college with all the practical work that they were doing was closed, and their firms were maybe considering whether they should make them unemployed or furlough them. And those apprenticeship schemes that we developed and rolled out from the summer of 2020 were really significant in keeping skills, trades and young people in jobs.
I want to move now in terms of businesses generally. The department came up with the engagement forum.
Yes.
If you could just briefly set out what the purpose of setting out the engagement forum was.
The engagement forum arose out of difficulties within industry around what was an essential industry, how to keep workers safe. It also arose from, I think, a little bit of mixed messaging that arose in the early days of the pandemic within the executive. And the engagement forum was a really useful tool in bringing business, trade unions, health and safety, the Public Health Agency, all of that very wide councils who were environmental health people from councils, all of those people who were engaged within the workplace in trying to make sure that some of our essential industry could continue, but that we could be assured that workers were safe.
And how effective was the engagement forum at performing those roles?
I think the engagement forum it had a task, a single task, that was to produce the working safely through the COVID pandemic document. It did that. It did further work in 2020 in relation to recovery and how we might look and have an inclusive recovery. And those who were engaged in the forum found it very, very useful. And in fact, it's probably a forum that is useful for any time, not just the pandemic.
Could more use have been made of it, do you think?
Potentially.
And when did it effectively cease to be producing any output?
I think it continued to meet probably late into 2020. Certainly the forum was around, and I had contact with the Labour Relations Agency throughout my tenure.
Did it have any role, for example, in the economic recovery through 2021?
Well, would it have inputted into the economic recovery plan?
Yes.
Or yes. I am unsure whether they were specifically identified, but they would have sat on the wider stakeholder groups. So the department has very, very wide stakeholder groups where trade unions and a very wide range of people are engaged in bringing these things together. And the economic recovery plan was not something that was dreamt of by officials. It was designed and co-designed by people within business and unions and so on.
Yes. Moving on then to the creation of the coronavirus regulations that were made on the 28th of March 2020. You didn't have any input into the content of those regulations. Do you think, as the Minister for the Economy of Northern Ireland, that you should have had an input into the content of them, given the impact that they would have upon business in Northern Ireland?
On reflection, probably, but they were health regulations and the Department of Health owned the regulations.
But there was going to have an impact that was going to go a lot wider than just health.
It was, yes.
And
They reflected the Coronavirus Act, and the regulations were part of the Northern Ireland.
But also going slightly further, and in your role as a minister, you would also want to make sure that the regulations would reflect the important aspects of Northern Irish society rather than simply aping what had been done in England. Is that fair?
Well, the regulations were very tailored to Northern Ireland in many, many ways.
When they were initially made?
Oh, well, no, but they, as the regulations grew and developed and were adapted, they were very tailored to Northern Ireland, and you can see exhaustive conversations about the regulations in the information you have.
But the focus is starting in a place which accurately represents the importance of facets of Northern Irish society rather than adopting them as time goes on.
The focus was on health. So the focus was on health, and those then became a wider set of regulations which were adapted many, many times. But the health, one department has to own the regulations, and the Department of Health was the owner of the regulations.
As those regulations developed, so through April and then into May 2020, did you ever get frustrated with what you may have perceived with a lack of progress or a lack of willingness to engage with expanding the economic response rather than just the public health response?
In the early part of the pandemic, we were all focused on the health response. I think I say in my evidence that I think that the lockdown was inevitable, that there was very little more that we could actually do. And there was a lot of work done in the early part on mitigation. But we had to expand our lives as we started to get the virus under control. And I think that you will probably have numerous documents and submissions from myself and the department around how we might take steps in terms of economic recovery.
If we can just show one of those now.
Yeah.
INQ 000226537. And this is a letter from yourself, Mrs. Dodds, to the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, dated the 6th of May 2020. And then I think that middle paragraph probably encapsulates a large element of what you were just saying and what you've been saying today. About the breadth of the impact and upon your approach.
I think that the pandemic, first and foremost, it impacted people who suffered from the virus and who lost their lives.
Because if we then
But it had a very wide, invasive impact on every part of our society.
Because if we go over to page 2, and then this is about you pressing the economic case, which was your responsibility as the Minister for the Department of the Economy, is that right?
I think it would seem almost incredible if the Minister for the Economy was not speaking about the economy and the impacts that the recession that we were currently experiencing and the lockdown would have on the economy and would have on people within the economy. It's not just about businesses, it's about the people and so on, and those jobs and those families that are impacted.
Because you followed up on this letter on the 9th of May, and then you sent a further letter on the 11th of May, in which you say, unfortunately, it seems that most of my concerns raised in the response to this letter still exists. Did you feel that at that point in early to mid-May 2020, that the points you were trying to raise about the importance of economic recovery were actually getting through?
I think in May, most people in the executive still wanted to focus on the pandemic, but we were managing our way through lockdown, but we couldn't keep the restrictions in place for forever, and we needed to lift our eyes and look about how we would mitigate that lockdown. And I think there is a paper that I sent to the executive around the first steps to economic recovery and how we might consider taking ourselves out of lockdown and the very, very incremental steps that would be needed to try to do that. So
I'm going to try and take you through some of your wording at the executive committee meetings, which hopefully will reflect some of these points. But before I do that, I mean, on the 21st of May 2020 at the executive committee meeting, you said that you were disappointed economic recovery not on the agenda. Were there times when you were trying to raise a paper for the agenda or trying to have a topic considered at the executive, but was actually then not put on the agenda?
I think at that particular time there was a very, very strong focus only on the pandemic and the health issues of the pandemic, and it was more difficult to get executive ministers to look at the rounded picture that we needed them to look at. We now know that lockdown has had really serious ramifications for health. We have the longest waiting lists in Europe. It has had really serious ramifications for Northern Ireland, and considering the whole information was really important. I followed up the paper in May with a strategy for medium-term economic recovery. So I think we had, from the department, lots of information to go on. But we needed a wider conversation.
In terms of that wider conversation then, so again, just returns to a point I was asking you about earlier on. How did you inform yourself as a department upon the impact of the response to the pandemic upon vulnerable people, so groups such as the disabled people?
The department, I mean, as I say, we looked at how, I mean, my department would have been concerned about how we include disabled people within the further education sphere, within the universities, higher education. It would have been looking at the impact of lockdown on the ability to engage in the workforce. But of course, the absolute truth of this in this situation is that many people with disabilities who were shielding were at home, and it was an incredibly difficult period for those people.
Yes, but again, it doesn't quite answer the question about how the department was trying to inform itself so it understood the issues that were facing those groups. Do you know what the department did, or is it just a bit too long ago to be able to provide the specificity?
I cannot recall the specifics of what the department did, but the outworkings of that are seen in some of the actions that we took and the plans that we put in place, and apprenticeships is a very good example of that.
Thank you. I want to move on now to social distancing reduction. So that occurred in June 2020. That was something that you had been pressing for at the 11th of June and the 15th of June Executive Committee meetings.
Yeah.
Is that right? And effectively there was a consensus within the executive. It wasn't just yourself or other members of your party who were seeking to advance this. There was other members of other parties.
Yes.
Is that right? And then on the 23rd of June, the Prime Minister announced that social distancing guidance in England would be reduced to 1 metre.
Yes.
And was that then a spark which then led on the 25th of June to the decision being taken to actually reduce from 2 metre to 1 metre?
So there were a number of issues in relation to social distancing. So if social distancing at 2 metres for many businesses would have made them unviable, so they simply couldn't have opened. It wouldn't have been possible because there just simply wasn't enough room to do that, and the number of tables that you could get in. I remember long discussions and discussed this with Sir Michael McBride, the CMO, on a number of occasions, and we came to the conclusion that this was a decision for the executive. And I say there was a range of executive ministers who wanted to do this in order to try to get us back on some kind of even keel, but that it could only be done with other mitigations in place. And I think shortly thereafter, the face masks were introduced in businesses and public life and so on.
And I'm not going to take you to your wording, but in those meetings you were balancing the need for the economic recovery with the health concerns.
Yes.
And
yes.
Again, it's right that you were receiving advice from the CMO and the CSA about the potential impact
Yes.
of the reductions, but they weren't at that time saying that it shouldn't be done.
No, that's right. That's right.
And around the same time, there was a decision taken to bring in indicative dates about when the easing of restrictions, which have been outlined in the executive approach to decision making from the 12th of May 2020.
Yes.
It was around that time that the indicative date discussion took place.
Yes, so it was, the idea was to try to have an incremental approach to easing restrictions. I don't think anyone in the executive wanted in any shape or form to go back, but we knew, and I don't think we could have had compliance if we hadn't made some efforts in order to try to ease life for people in Northern Ireland.
Did, in the end, though, adding indicative dates become problematic because it provided a focus point for businesses and other sectors to say, well, that's the date that we're working towards, and then if, in the event that those dates couldn't be met, it almost became worse than if no date had been given in the first place?
So this is a complex issue. So the paper was issued with no dates, and that was a big problem for business. So we then decided to say that on such and such a date in June or July, we will do so whatever, if the R rate and the transmission of the virus allows us to do that. It perhaps maybe built us up to expectations, but I think it was one of those issues where business didn't want, and the society in general didn't want, and I don't know, I remember and I recall very clearly the campaign to open holiday parks to allow people to go to mobile homes and caravans and so on. So we had to give people some sense of when things were going to happen, but always with the caveat that it was important that we were in the right place in terms of our.
On reflection, with the way that indicative dates were handled, would you do anything differently if it was to happen again?
That I genuinely can't answer that. I think we did what we could at the time. And I think that hindsight, as they say, is a wonderful thing. And we, but I don't think that we could have done radically different things. I think we tried to manage expectations about reopening, but we also tried to manage the safety and health and well-being of people.
Moving then on to your view of the impact of the Bobby Story funeral. Again, just to be clear, I'm not going to ask you for your view on the merits of what happened on that day. I'm interested in your view on what the impact was on the response to the pandemic. You say in your statement, it's, if we can have INQ 000436924, it's page 15, paragraph 57. My note has gone wrong. It runs from page 56, paragraph 56 into 57. But what you say is, it's my personal view that the single biggest issue and topic of conversation in relation to compliance, there's top of paragraph 56, I'm very grateful.
Yes.
In relation to compliance and the spread of the virus during the summer of 2020 was the burial of Bobby Story. If we do go back to paragraph 56, I'll provide the right instructions in a minute. If we go back to paragraph 57, apologies.
Happens to us all, Mr. Scott.
And then another, though less significant factor in my view, is that the Eat Out to Help Out scheme was also introduced in summer 2020. Just dealing one point about Eat Out to Help Out, you weren't consulted.
No.
What are you basing your assessment that the biggest issue about compliance and the words the spread of the virus was the Bobby Story funeral as opposed to any other factor?
So I think we have to take ourselves back just ever so slightly. In the months before the funeral, the First Minister and Deputy First Minister had spent very, very significant periods of time giving daily press conferences, telling people that they could do this or they couldn't do that or they couldn't do the other. And they had spent, and those press conferences in our community in Northern Ireland were very well listened to, attended. You know, they were very, I think they were an effective communication tool in that sense. And it was an effective way that these two leaders could do this. And in those press conferences, we asked people to do really difficult things. And it's important to remember that. And then we had the funeral of Mr. Story, where we had thousands of people on the streets, where we had, I don't know, a memorial, I don't know what really is the proper phrase for it, at Milltown Cemetery, and where on the same day that other families had to bury their loved ones, the Story family were allowed into the crematorium, but others weren't. So I think in that, and in that act, and in attending that there was almost the signal that you can do as I say, but not as I do. And I think that, and I don't have scientific data for it, so I'm going to preempt that part of your question. I don't have scientific data for it, but I do think it was very, very significant. And I haven't seen the newly found minutes of the executive meeting after the Bobby Story funeral, but I remember it, where many of the ministers, not just from my party, but across the executive, were really thought that the communication tool that we had used very effectively in Northern Ireland was incredibly damaged by what had happened, and that was almost kind of like an entitlement that I could do this, but other families couldn't.
Well, you've answered the scientific advice point. So, in terms of the relationship between the executive members, in and around late June 2020, had there been discussions amongst the executive about issues such as numbers at funerals
Yes, there
and
had.
numbers of gatherings?
Yes.
And at any point, had it been raised with any of the executive committee members that an issue such as, or scenes such as were seen at Mr. Story's funeral may happen?
No.
Did
I
those
actually,
circumstances
sorry,
have-
can I just say, on the day of the funeral, I actually had meetings all day. I didn't actually see it, but I saw it later on the news. I didn't see it.
Did the circumstances about what you've been discussing in the run-up to Mr. Story's funeral, in the context of what then happened, did that have any impact upon the ability of the executive to work together and the relations between the individual ministers?
I think it damaged relations. I cannot say that it didn't damage relations. I think it did. But what and I think it's really important to stress this, that even though, I suppose, I'm not quite sure how to express it, but people felt let down by what had happened. People felt annoyed. This is just executive ministers, not real people out in our community. So that it was really difficult then to stand at another press conference and actually say, we are going to allow you to do this, when all of this had taken place just a few days before it. So I think that there was real anger. I think executive ministers from across different parties expressed the view that we were severely damaged by this particular event. And I think as well that maybe the lack of remorse in the immediate aftermath of the funeral for having done this was really important. And if you contrast that with...
Apologies, Mrs. Dodger, but if
Sorry.
I could just take you slightly forward, because
Yes.
unless there's anything particular that you really want to say at that point, if I could just ask to address the increase in rates in autumn 2020 and your actions
Yes.
in autumn 2020. At any point in autumn 2020, do you consider that you went against the scientific advice that you've been provided by the CMO and the CSA? And if so, would you please say when that was?
What I asked for in the autumn of 2020 was, as I have stressed all along, and I note that the Chief Scientific Officer said, I saw it as my duty to represent those people that my department engaged with, those people in the economy, workers, women, young people, people who were really severely impacted by the series of lockdowns. I hugely respected the advice, but I think I tested and questioned that advice, and I think that that is the right thing to do for a minister in the executive, and I think that that is important.
But you do say in your statement, I'm not a scientist, but I've been in politics for a very long time and I'm accustomed to asking questions and scrutinising information. You may test advice, but if there's no contrary advice, on what basis would you go against it when it's talking about a matter such as public health transmission rates?
I don't think that I particularly went against the main thrust of the public health advice over the course of the pandemic at any time. Personally, I was very careful not to go against the thrust of that advice. I did question, I did test that advice, and there were times when that was the right thing to do. And I did put forward the view of those people who were deeply impacted by the pandemic.
But in terms of the slightly on again, off again restrictions that came in October through to December, do you not consider that at any point you actually did go against the advice by the CMO or the CSA by not accepting their recommendation of the restrictions that should have been applied at that time in order to provide what they considered to be the most effective response?
Well, the CMO and the CSA have always given advice to the executive. They gave that advice in the knowledge that the executive would then have to apply all of the other issues that it had to balance in relation to that. The autumn of 2020 was an exceptionally difficult time. I've described some of the economic issues, but there were huge issues for the transmission of the virus. There were huge issues for families who lost loved ones, and that will stay with all of us forever. So it's important that when we are considering really impactful decisions, that we look at those decisions in the round. I don't think that I went against advice, but I asked them to consider advice. I at one stage I had a meeting with the CMO and CSA and the Health Minister on regular occasions to see if there are other things that we could do that would help us to keep business open, but to do it safely so that people would be safe, both those who work in it and those who would come in.
If I can test you with one point further from your own statement, you say in March 2020, I believe the only approach available to decision makers was to follow the science, by which I mean taking decisions based on the recommendations being provided by DOH, the CMO and CSA, which was in turn based on the best available data and modelling then being produced. Mm-hmm. Did you change from that approach?
No, I didn't. But I think what did change, and what, as we grew accustomed to the information and the science and the wider context of where we were, I think that we were able to question that more robustly than we may have done in March. In March, I'm of the view that we could not have done anything differently.
Going to move on to the ECT that came in the 1st of December, the Executive COVID Task Force. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know whether you've had the opportunity to see or hear any of the evidence that was provided by Jenny Piper, the interim head of the civil service at the time.
No.
The evidence of Ms. Piper was that, from the transcript, that, so you haven't heard it before, that there was pushback, particularly from two ministers, from the Minister of Health and the Minister for the Economy. Not an absolute pushback, but concerns were raised about how the task force would operate. Mm-hmm. And then I think the Economy Minister remained throughout my time impatient with the pace of the lifting of restrictions as they apply to the business community, particularly as we got beyond Easter, and a very strong call came from the hospitality and tourism sectors. Would you agree with that, or would you take a different view about whether you had any pushback to the creation of the ECT?
I didn't have any pushback to the creation of it. I had a pushback, as did the Minister for Health, about the system that was being set up. So I generally viewed the task force as being a fairly process-driven organisation, so that civil servants tend to see everything through the lens of process. So if I describe how the task force would have worked in relation to,
I don't want to cover evidence that we've already heard, because
no, this is entirely so. I would have sent up information to the task force about potentially looking at the reopening of whatever. The task force then would have gone through a process of sifting and talking and bringing further information back to that. And then I would have heard from civil servants that this could not happen. I think it made ministers at one remove from what was the decisions over which they had legal responsibility as well.
But then again, the ECT wasn't taking decisions, was it? It was providing its view as a structured approach to considering the easing of restrictions.
Yes.
And it was then upon the ministers to decide whether they would agree with that suggestion or not.
But I think by the time it had gone through that process, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion. It was slow, cumbersome and process-driven. And I'm firmly of that view.
But it was definitely something that you could have pushed back against the advice that you were receiving from the ECT and challenged it and taken a different view.
Well, I could have, but I wouldn't have thought that there was a huge degree of success around that. And I think it was a difficult format. I often think that we could have had a more flexible approach, but I don't think that that is the nature of the civil service in Northern Ireland.
Well, I believe, I haven't got the reference to hand, but I believe you say in your statement that you were actually looking for a structured approach to easing restrictions. Are you suggesting that wasn't the structured approach that you were looking for?
It wasn't a structured approach that I thought was flexible and transparent.
Okay. The last topic is in relation to public statements that you made. So there was, on and around the 21st of September, there was a public statement that had been made by you to the effect that you'd warned that Northern Ireland simply couldn't afford another lockdown.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? And at that time, that contrasted with what the health minister had announced, that a circuit breaker couldn't be taken off the table.
Yeah.
Was it effective in terms of the way that the population of Northern Ireland would receive ministers in public providing competing views? Was that an effective way to convey the message to the population of Northern Ireland, or do you think that was just going to be confusing?
I don't see these statements in opposition to each other, in actual fact. I'm speaking as the Minister for the Economy, the Minister responsible for people who may lose their jobs, for businesses who may have to lay off more workers because of the reduction in furlough, for an executive that actually wasn't really sure at that stage in September where the funding would come from. And as I mentioned, the 3.3 billion of 3.9 billion that came from central government for direct action on the virus in Northern Ireland was as a matter of Barnett consequentials. And I think better planning would have helped us all in relation to that, better planning in relation to when we knew finance was going to be made available and how that we could then direct that into action. But in September 2020, businesses were allowed to recover 70% on
Can I just bring you
furlough
back?
and only 60% in October.
If I can just bring you back to the point about public statements from two different ministers, which may be providing two different perspectives, in this case the health perspective and the economic perspective. You may not have intended it or thought it was confusing. Would you accept that the population may have considered it confusing for these public statements to be made, as opposed to these matters to have been dealt with entirely within the Executive Committee itself?
That may be a point, but I'm very clear that those people whose jobs depended on what we could do, on what mitigations we could provide, needed to know how we could move forward. So if we were going into circuit breaker, and I didn't, that was what we did, then we needed to know how we could support people and how we could support businesses and how we could sustain it, because in the long run, as we emerge from COVID, it's really important that we knew how we were going to be able to do all of that, and that we would have the level of skill and businesses retained within the economy to provide prosperity. And I do believe that a prosperous Northern Ireland is actually a stable Northern Ireland.
But don't they need to hear that from the government that's taken the decision about what's to happen, as opposed to what a minister would like to happen, but which might not actually end up being the decision of the Executive Committee?
People will have different views on it.
Okay. I have no further questions, my lady.
Thank you very much indeed for your help. I'm very grateful.
Thank you.
I don't think I should be asking you to come again, but I'm really grateful for the help you've given so far.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very well. I shall return at 3:15.
All right.
Strina.
Good afternoon, my lady. May I please call Deirdre Hargey and Carol McKillen?
information first. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the
the
truth,
whole truth,
the whole
and
truth,
nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Thank you. Just stay there, hold the Bible in your right hand, and just repeat the words after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the
the
truth,
whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
I hope we haven't kept you hanging around for too long.
No, you're okay. Good afternoon to both of you, and thank you both
Afternoon.
for attending this afternoon and for your assistance to the inquiry. As you give your evidence, could I remind you just to keep your voices up and to try and speak into the microphone? And if we could all do our best not to talk over each other as well, for the benefit of the stenographer. Now, you have each provided Module 2C with a witness statement. Ms Hargy, your statement is at INQ 000446235. And if we turn to page 51, you signed that statement on the 12th of March 2024.
I did.
Are the contents of that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is.
And Ms McKillen, your statement is at INQ 000436131. And turn into page 45, please. You signed that statement on the 12th of March 2024.
I did.
And are the contents of your statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
Thank you. Now, you're both here this afternoon because you both held the position of Communities Minister at different points during the pandemic. And in terms of how I propose to approach your evidence today, I plan to take the issues chronologically. So, Ms Hargy, I'll begin with you, and once I've concluded your evidence, Ms McKillen, I'll turn to you.
Okay.
And I'd like to just start at the outset with your political careers by way of introduction. Ms Hargy, immediately prior to the pandemic, you spent just over 9 years as a councillor for Belfast City Council, and for a year of that period you were Mayor of Belfast.
That's right. From December 2010, I was co-opted onto the council until then January 2020, and I was the mayor between the period of June 18 to June 19.
And then in January 2020, you were then elected to the Northern Ireland Assembly for the first time.
I was co-opted. I was elected then in the following election, but co-opted in January, and then became, yes, Minister for the Department of Communities.
And that happened pretty much straight away.
Within less than a week, yes.
And so just at the time of the beginning of the pandemic, becoming a global health emergency, you were simultaneously getting to grips with the level of responsibility you perhaps hadn't previously experienced. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think we come into the department obviously with an absence, with the executive not running for the previous few years. There were huge portfolios, certainly within the Department of Communities. And I suppose coming from the New Decade New Approach Agreement, there was also expectations in terms of a programme of work that we would have to deliver. One of the big areas were welfare, social security mitigations, which was a priority in an incoming new executive.
Okay, thank you. And we'll come to touch on the work of your department in just a moment. But in your statement, you explain that Ms McKillen stepped in temporarily to replace you on the 15th of June until the 16th of December 2020. You were on a leave of absence due to illness, is that?
Yes, I took ill health in June and had to have open surgery and returned to duties then in December.
And Ms McKillen, you have been an MLA since 2007 and you were recently appointed as Principal Deputy Speaker.
That's correct.
And you explain in your statement that you have previous ministerial experience, having held what was then the Office of Minister of Culture, Arts and Leisure between
That's correct.
2011 and 2016.
Yes.
And you also explain that from January 2020 until June 2020, you sat on the Committee for Communities.
That's correct.
Is that right? And therefore, you would have been familiar, you say, with the work of Ms Hargy's department throughout
That's
the early
right.
stage of the pandemic.
Yes.
And Ms Hargy, just to complete the chronology before we get into your evidence, you then returned to office on the 16th of December and remained in the office until the conclusion of the period with which Module 2C is concerned.
Yes, that was correct.
Now, just picking up with the role of the Department for Communities and the areas that you just touched on a moment ago, the department has strategic responsibility for quite a broad range of areas, and through its strategic policy and professional services group, the department leads on a number of social inclusion policy areas, and to name some of those: poverty, gender equality, LGBTQ+ policy, active ageing and disability. Is that
Yes,
fair
that
summary?
was right. These were set out in the New Decade New Approach Agreement, which seen the restoration of the Assembly in 2020. And I had policy lead responsibility to develop those new strategies, which hadn't been there before.
And in your statement, you characterised the department's overall aim as tackling disadvantage and building sustainable communities. Presumably, the department's efforts in tackling disadvantage are primarily directed towards those groups that I've just mentioned. Is that correct?
Yes, they would be, and also with the addition of class, which often isn't picked up in Section 75 groups in terms of social class and the impact of deprivation on those communities.
Thank you. And I'd like to turn now to look at your department's response in the early stages of the pandemic. And in your statement, you explain that in the early part of 2020, whilst the Northern Ireland Central Crisis Management Arrangements, which I'll refer to as NICMA for short, whilst those arrangements hadn't been activated, you say that a cross-departmental approach had nevertheless commenced and that your department had commenced preparatory work. Is that correct?
Yes, well, there would have been, in terms of obviously early indications of COVID, there would have been discussions at the executive in January into February that would have been under any other business as part of that executive meeting. And then obviously as we stepped into the March period, then that was put as a standalone item on the executive. And I know behind the scenes there were obviously mechanisms being put in place across the civil service to ensure that departments were talking to each other, but also within each of their departments that we were making plans in terms of mitigating and responding to, I suppose, the unknowns in some regards of what was going to lie ahead of us.
And in terms of the preparatory work that had happened within the Department for Communities in that early stage between January and March, what did that look like in practice?
Well, I think initially it would have been getting into probably more the February into the March period, where there would have been engagements with, I suppose, the permanent secretary within the department, also with the senior management team within the department as well, by way of making sure that we were ready. I think the first big issue was to ensure, obviously, staff, and as the issue of self-isolating started to come as a feature in late February, getting into early March, we obviously had to ensure that our essential services, such as paying social security benefits and all of that, that those services could continue unhindered, because obviously they would impact on some of the more vulnerable groupings within our society. And there was a focus to ensure that within our staff teams within the department that we did have arrangements in place to ensure that benefits could be paid, but also to ensure that we give flexibility. For example, I know we moved early in March to make plans for the community and voluntary sector in particular, that we would give flexibility in any of the funding that the department had with outside organisations and bodies, that we would allow flexibility in those funding arrangements to allow them to respond to the pandemic.
Okay, and we'll come on in just a moment to look at some of the more specific measures that you've just touched on. But sticking with this early point in the pandemic, in a text message to Chris Stewart on the 11th of March 2020, and I don't think I need to bring it up, Sir David Stirling, who was the head of the civil service, said, "I spoke to Tracy earlier. She's briefing her minister," and in parenthesis, "who has shown no interest in COVID up to now, tomorrow." Now, the Permanent Secretary to your department was Tracy Maharg, and this would therefore appear to be a reference to you, Ms Hargey. Is that a fair characterisation of your attitude towards COVID-19 up to that point?
Well, that certainly is not my reflection of what happened, and indeed I'm disappointed to have seen the text message and the contents that are contained within it. Because if you look at the executive meeting the day before that message was sent on the 10th of March, I reported to the executive at that meeting that my own department were working on plans and contingencies by way of looking at COVID. I have also set out in my statement on the 10th of March that I was preparing a public statement in terms of how we would support key sectors within the department, and particularly those that we would work with to respond to the pandemic as it started to fold. Also within my statement, it sets out a number of actions that were taken around the emergence of the COVID community helpline later in March. And also the emergency leadership group. That would have took a couple of weeks of planning to put resources in place. They took place in the 3rd week of March. So we would have been planning at the start of March, late February, for that to happen. So I am disappointed at that text message. I don't think it reflects in terms of where we were, or indeed the conversations that I had with Tracy Maharg as my permanent secretary. My focus from early on, when we were aware that there could have been a pandemic, was how will this impact on sections of our population. I knew that obviously we were coming out of a 3-year period of no assembly. I could see the devastating impact that a decade of austerity had had, particularly on certain sections of our community, and even on the back of the financial crisis in 2008 as well. And what I talked about even within my statement, that when you get societal shocks like that, it impacts on certain sections of our population more than others, and a global pandemic would be no different in that regard.
Well, just for you to speak more slowly.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. I've got the same failing, so I do understand. It's very difficult to change your speech patterns, but if you just keep it, otherwise, the stenographer will have my
apologies.
I'll try to remember to do the same, my lady. And Ms Hargey, perhaps if I could bring up on screen a document that perhaps demonstrates some of the planning that you had been doing at that early stage. Thank you. This is INQ, just for the record, 000863935. My apologies. Now, this is an extract from a non-health sectoral resilience return, and we can see that it's dated the 13th of March 2020. Now, this is one section relating to your department, which is taken from a wider return, which contains returns from each department. And if we just look, if we could perhaps scroll onto the next page. So the return from the Department of Communities spans 2 pages, and we can see that 3 key areas of concern are listed for your department. And those are welfare and financial services to the public, the advice sector, and social housing. And we can see that there is some passing reference, for example, thank you, to vulnerable citizens being disproportionately impacted, but it doesn't necessarily tell us who they are or what those impacts might be. The RAG rating column isn't completed, and really it doesn't tell us very much. And I wanted to ask you, does this return adequately capture the key areas of concern for your department at that time?
It wouldn't, in terms of the scope of the department, and also in terms of, I suppose, the conversations we were having around the potential impacts, particularly as you were moving into the March period. You were looking at the potential of lockdowns or closures of schools and events, for example. And I know, again, even on the executive meeting, I think it was on the 10th of March, I highlighted issues around even childcare provision, again, looking at the voluntary and community sector, looking at communications and messaging. And I know certainly in the work that we were doing, it broadened beyond those 3 key areas. I mean, obviously, in terms of the advice sector, the paying of social security benefits was vital, that we continued those services, that we had the staff teams. Housing was also a critical area, particularly those that were homeless, and vulnerabilities around the spread of a virus. They were critical. But I know also quickly on the 23rd of March, for example, we had worked with the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland in launching a community fund. And part of the criteria and area of that fund was to work with older people. And that was a reflection, I suppose, that the older age group, those with disabilities, young people, working class communities and minority ethnic communities would be more susceptible or vulnerable. That's why we did, in the early days in March, sign up.
I'm loath to interrupt you, but we will come to look at those. I'd just like to focus on this return just for now, in terms of capturing what your department was doing at this time. And I wanted to ask you, why, in the context of what had by then been declared a global pandemic, is there no specific mention of tackling disadvantage as a key area of concern, when we know that that is a particular aim or core strategic responsibility for the Department of Communities?
I don't know why that's specific. I mean, I wouldn't have been responsible for giving that return, but certainly what I can say is that the conversations, the work programmes that we were looking at went well beyond that. And again, that was one of the reasons why I established the Emergency Leadership Group on the 20th of March, which included representation from some of those key sectors to ensure that whatever interventions we were designing, that we were doing that in partnership with the organisations and those impacted on the ground. So I don't know why the return doesn't reflect all of that work. And as I say, even at that point, there was planning with the advice sector, for example, to establish the COVID community helpline, which launched on the 27th of March. So planning for that would have even been before the 13th of March. And one of the key reasons we set the helpline up was for those vulnerable categories, those who would have been shielding, was to ensure that they did have a point of contact in which we could give advice and information, and importantly signpost people to support. So I don't know why it wasn't reflected in that return. I think we probably could have filled hundreds of pages of a return in terms of some of the work that the department could be doing, but I can't answer why that wasn't sent back in. I don't know.
Okay. And I'd like to just explore with you your knowledge of the development of the pandemic in the early stages as well. On a paragraph 19 of your statement, and this is at INQ 000446235, you indicate that the executive held its first substantive discussion about COVID-19 on the 2nd of March. And this is what you say about that meeting. And we can see that you say the CMO observed that most people would have a minor illness like a cold, 98% would get better. He said that the fatality rate could be 2 to 3%. The peak could last for 15 weeks and 50% or more of the population could be affected. But lots of minor cases, very mild. And I think if we just look down towards the bottom of that paragraph, you said that you were concerned that there was an inconsistency between the medical and scientific advice that you were receiving and that being given to other countries. Very briefly, Ms Hargey, what was the nature of your concern about the advice that you were receiving at that time?
Well, I think at the start, I mean, from, I suppose, January right through, health were kind of taking the lead because it was a health pandemic. That said, there were updates that were given to the executive. I think as we approached into the March period, I mean, with the role of social media now, with press statements from the World Health Organisations, you could just see on, as I say, social media platforms, how the virus was developing in other countries. Obviously, the approach and the advice here was to take a steady approach. We're in a containment phase. And I suppose at that point, from that executive meeting and as we progressed through March, there were concerns raised. Are we moving quickly enough? Are we taking a proactive approach as much as we could? And I think, that's where the discussions were, and particularly as you move into the second week and into March, the issue around school closures, the public advice and information, that the public were getting even in terms of the island because the South had moved in terms of introducing measures, and people living here don't see a border in that regards. They see one part of the island moving and the other part not. So we were concerned, was the pace in terms of our response to the pandemic, was it enough? Was it appropriate? And what more could be done? And I suppose in all of this, I mean, you were looking at best practice wherever you could get it, obviously from the health professionals here. I believe people were trying to do their best at that moment in time. But of course, you wanted to look north and south, you wanted to look east and west, and you also wanted to look internationally in terms of, what is the advice? What is the best practice, what's working well and what's not.
Just to clarify, Ms Hargey, it's not the case then that you had access to scientific advice beyond that you were getting from the CMO and CSA?
No.
It was really that sort of what you were perceiving in the media, essentially?
Well, it's what you were getting from statements from the likes of the World Health Organization. Yes, it's what you were picking up in terms of other jurisdictions, what they were moving on. It's not that you were contradicting the advice that you were getting, because we were taking the advice from the medical officers and from the Department of Health, but we had a responsibility also to query that advice to ensure, that we did fully understand it. And of course that you were, as I say, looking north, south, east, west, and then more broadly beyond the islands as well.
And I'd just like to bring up the notes of the executive meeting on the 19th of March, and this is at INQ 0000655737. And here we can see Minister Swan advising the executive essentially of the worst case scenario for COVID-19, and he refers to 32,000 cases per day with 9,500 deaths, and he describes those as scary numbers. Now, in your statement, you characterise this as a significant shift in the medical and scientific advice being given to ministers, and you said that the information now being provided was alarming and the potential consequences were frightening. Do you suggest that this was really the point at which you began to appreciate the gravity of the pandemic?
Well, I think it was before that, because I think it was in a meeting, I may get it wrong, it was around the 16th of March,
Correct.
where I was noted as saying, that people were terrified, words to that effect. And I think it was also noted, I think it might have been Conor Murphy, as the minister saying, that people were taking their own actions as well, with what seemed to be the lack of action. Or at least the pace of action within the executive, particularly around school closures and larger events. We believe that should have moved quicker. So there were those tensions as such in terms of the pace. And I think that would have even been before that advice that the Health Minister had gave. We had been raising concerns around the pace, around school closures, the fact that, Belfast City Council cancelled their St Patrick's Day event. I think that was a big marker. And also what you were seeing from the ground was that people were actually, making decisions themselves within their own families and within the home. For example, of not sending their children to school, of isolating and taking those practical steps.
Yes, and with that in mind, just coming back to what you've said in your statement, characterising this as a significant shift, would it therefore not be fair or accurate to say that actually was a significant shift, given that you were already concerned and on the 2nd of March you had been told that the fatality rate could be 2 to 3%, the peak could last for 15 weeks and over 50% of the population could be affected?
I think it was a significant shift in that in early March it was a gradual, steady response and it was a containment phase. And then as you move towards that meeting, obviously everything was being scaled up and things got more serious. So yes, there's no doubt that there was a shift, but I suppose some were articulating before that meeting in the previous executive meeting, that would have been the time to move, or at least even before that again. And I suppose that was part of the discussions and the deliberations at the executive meetings during that period.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to just move on very briefly to come back to the activation of the NICMA arrangements. And we know that the executive agreed to activate those arrangements.
Which arrangements, sorry?
The Northern Ireland Central Crisis Management arrangements. I'm abbreviating that to NICMA to save myself from getting tongue-tied. But in your statement, you suggest that setting up those arrangements earlier would have assisted the executive, as ministers could have stepped in and provided the necessary leadership at an earlier stage in the pandemic. And I think you've already suggested that perhaps the Department of Health was taking the lead at that time prior to the activation of these arrangements. But what, if anything, did you see as the benefits of standing up those arrangements at an earlier stage, in light of your answers that your department had already begun preparatory work?
I think it probably could have been the cross-departmental nature and looking at the intersectionality across each of the departments. You maybe could have highlighted things a lot earlier. I think obviously, in hindsight, we can now see that if we had have done things earlier, that would have been a better outcome, than when you were going through it at that point in time. And I think it shows now, if you were doing it again, that you would ensure that those contingency arrangements, that the planning would have been done sooner, and to ensure that it wasn't maybe, whilst one department may take the lead as such, that all departments around the executive table, that there is that intersectionality in terms of issues, and that we could have been engaging and planning around those issues much earlier.
And would that have assisted your department in terms of having that source of information from health? Might it have assisted
I think
your
most
planning?
definitely it would have assisted all departments, but we potentially could have hit the ground running a lot sooner. So instead of, for example, the community helpline being set up later in March, we could have maybe had that set up in February or early March, You know, so where there is room for improvements or things that we could have done sooner, you know, as I say, with the benefit of hindsight now, that should have been done, yes.
Now, Ms Hargey, we've already touched on some of the initiatives that your department has set up, and you've mentioned the voluntary and community sector emergency leadership group. And as I understand it, that was really a mechanism for your department to gather information directly from community and grassroots organisations. Have I got that right?
I think it was to do it. There was an emergency leadership group within the department that was there before I had even come into the department, but it would have been large regional organisations like the Red Cross. When I came into the department and we were being hit with the COVID pandemic, I thought it was important that, of course, those organisations remain, but that we also had input and voices from the grassroots, from direct lived experience on the ground. And I broadened the emergency leadership group to make sure we were taking in as much of that input, also including local councils, for example, that we have 11 public authorities across the north. And it was important that if we were going to plan interventions, it just wasn't taking a sounding. We also worked with the emergency leadership group as we moved through the pandemic in designing what the mitigations and responses would look like. And in some regards, we co-designed some of those interventions as we started to move forward.
Just on that
Slow,
point.
please.
Sorry, apologies.
Just on that point, Ms Hargey, are you able to offer us an example of how information or co-production, as you've put it, with those groups fed back up the chain and really informed any mitigations that your department put in place?
Well, I think one was the COVID community helpline. We worked, one of the partners that we have within the department is Advice NI, that we would work with on benefits advice across the board. They had already operated a helpline in terms of those issues around benefits and support. And through the work of the emergency leadership group and through the connections that we had decided rather than recreating the wheel or creating something new, which would have took longer time, we partnered up and twinned with Advice NI to then develop the COVID community helpline to ensure that we could establish it sooner rather than later. We recognised and respected that they had a plethora of knowledge of other organisations on the ground, that if someone did phone in, no matter what their issue or concern was, that they had that knowledge that they could signpost people to support. So there were interventions like that. I think also early on in terms of the heating payments that we brought forward in terms of financial hardship for people, I think also the food delivery. So again, access to food, not just in terms of priority supermarket slots, but also that particularly for low-income families that maybe don't fit within the benefit system, there was early indications coming from communities on the ground that they were being impacted in terms of being out of work, in terms of maybe having to come out of work for care and responsibilities, particularly when the schools closed. And we worked through the emergency leadership group on things even what should be contained within the food boxes, how do we distribute those, and through that collaboration it was agreed that we would set up 11 regional hubs using the local councils, because again they're closer to the ground than what the department is. They know the communities in which they're operating in, and they have a network of community organisations then that could distribute that food. And over the course of the food distribution, just as one example, over 200,000 food parcels were delivered to communities across the north.
And I'd just like to look a little more closely at a couple of those interventions that you've mentioned. Perhaps we could have on screen, please, INQ 0000065829. Now, this is an extract from a TEO daily sit rep on the 4th of April. And if we could go to page 3 of that, please. Item 1 says that complaints were received on calls to the COVID-19 community helpline by vulnerable people going unanswered, a risk that needs will be unmet. And it says that your department was working with Advice NI and Council Chief Executives to address that issue. At that stage, Ms Hargey, that helpline had been operational for about 1 week.
Yeah.
What had gone wrong, if anything, and how long did it take to resolve that issue?
Well, I think clearly because I was very directly involved, I would have been involved in those meetings within that first week of the helpline being established. It was oversubscribed in terms of the demand, and I think that was an early indication of the demand that was out there, the confusion around information, people who were out on the ground who genuinely wanted. So I think on the one hand it showed that the helpline was working and that people had found out about it and they were phoning. We just didn't have the people power there to sustain the amount of calls. We urgently then reviewed the situation. I was directly involved in meetings with Advice NI and within the department as well, and we brought about additional funding for that service to ensure that Advice NI could bring forward more personnel in order to oversee the phones. We looked at interim arrangements actually where members of staff were also redirected within the Social Security and within the Department of Community system. So there was a real effort to try and make sure that we mitigated against that risk. With the huge swelling of numbers. This also correlated with, for example, the huge increase in people that came to the Social Security system. We were on average getting an additional 16,000 people a week that were then presenting for Social Security payments that weren't before, and certainly within the first month nearly of the pandemic, there was an increase in universal credit claims of over 40,000. So these were the type of numbers and the demand on the system that we were starting to be impacted by, and we tried to move as quickly as we could in order to meet those needs. I think really what it highlights, was the importance of the helpline, the fact that it was oversubscribed, that the message did get out, I think, through the emergency leadership group and through our community contacts that the helpline was there. We recognised initially there wasn't enough resource and maybe we underestimated the initial demand, and we worked very quickly to try and rectify that as soon as possible.
Yes, and the other initiative that I wanted to pick up on with you was the Access to Food initiative, and you had mentioned online priority slots. And we know that in England, elderly and vulnerable people were at the outset able to access those slots online, but that in Northern Ireland, your department had said that it was too complex to replicate that here. And very briefly, I just wanted to ask if you could shed any light on the particular difficulty.
This was one area in terms of cross-departmental working. So the social market slots in England Health System have a centralised database. So when they had looked at their shielding letters and who were going to receive them, they had one database that they could print off of those who were shielded. Here we had over 500 because it's within each of the local general practice surgeries across the north, so your local doctor's surgery, and that's how the Department of Health letters were issued in terms of those shielding and the vulnerable groups. That took an extra amount of time. I think it was almost 2 months additional to actually contact all of those 500 different surgeries to get the information back in. So I think there's definite learning in the pandemic in terms of the system within health and how that's structured, having a centralised database. I suppose not having a centralised database at that point hindered and delayed some of the interventions that we could do. In the meantime, we did try to work with supermarkets and particularly with local providers around trying to make sure, that if somebody self-identified that they were vulnerable, that they had the letter, that should be accepted. I think also at that time as well, that's why we started the food box initiative of over 200 food boxes that were then distributed across the north as well,
yes,
was to try and complement some of those gaps and some of those shortcomings in the database.
I'd just like to ask you about the food box scheme. In a report published by Disability Action in September 2020, the organisation was critical of the support that had been offered and suggested that at times, and I think you've accepted this earlier, it was potentially inconsistent at times, and at times it was unsuitable. Were you aware of concerns around the consistency of the scheme at that time?
Well, I recognise we were moving at pace. We were trying to respond to the urgent need that was presenting itself, and food was one of those key areas that was coming up. Within the emergency leadership group, we had two groups that kind of cover the broad disability area, Inspire NI and also the Now Project, who actually work within food as well. So we were taking advice from them. I did read the Disability Action report that they did produce in January 2020, and I completely recognise the difficulties that were presented in the midst of a pandemic. And of course, I do recognise that there are areas that we definitely need to improve. I think, for example, you know, having disability action maybe involved in the emergency leadership group and other strands of work, that there is definite learning that we can pick up from that. We did try to move at pace at that time to make sure that that group was reflective as much as it could be, but not too big that you couldn't then do anything in terms of quick interventions. But were there shortcomings when you look back on that period? Absolutely. And are there lessons to be learned? Totally. And I think one of the big lessons was, even in terms of the disability strategy that my department had responsibility for, is to ensure that any of these interventions, whether they're short-term or long-term, that we co-produce and we co-design the interventions and the work with the sector. And certainly lessons for the department is we did that with the disability strategy, where we worked directly with them. They worked with the departments in designing that strategy going forward.
Thank you, Ms Hargey. I'll give you a break now and I'll turn to you, Ms Nickillen. I'm sorry I've been ignoring you.
You're okay.
Now, your first day in the role was on the 15th of June 2020.
That's right.
When you came into office, were there any ongoing issues or difficulties within the department related to the pandemic response that you had to resolve?
Not that I was aware of. I mean, I had, I suppose, the foresight of sitting on the Communities Committee. So a lot of the scrutiny role, and that's the purpose of the committee, of the department, of the different interventions. Now, obviously, if there was internal issues, they would not have been known to the committee. But I didn't see any. I seen a department that was very proactive. I would consider it, I had the privilege of working with officials who really wanted to do their best and who were actually proud of the initiatives that Deirdre had brought forward. Deirdre had instilled very much a team approach rather than, you know, us and them or whatever. So I have to say, I was quite impressed when I came in, albeit on your first day. You've gone straight into an executive meeting, you get your first day brief, and I had the experience of being in a department previously for 5 years, so I had the experience and the knowledge to try and look underneath some of the things, but
Okay.
it was very good.
And were there any learnings from the first wave, for example, that you saw being implemented at that time? Was that something that the department was turning its mind to at that point?
So I think, yes, there were. So, for example, the issue that Deirdre spoke about earlier, and you have raised yourself, around how do you ensure that where gaps are identified, you try and close them as best possible. Now, Deirdre's already mentioned it. I'm sure I too listened to the disability Nuala Toman's evidence, and I've since read the report, and I suppose was a bit upset because I just didn't like the feeling that someone felt that we thought they were invisible, to be honest. But in terms of, you know, even at the very early stages, see, I'm coming and I'm getting into the department on the basis that there was already inequalities there before COVID. So it's quite fair to say I do not believe a rising tide floats all boats, because it does not. I'm also coming into a department like Deirdre, where there has been 3 years of a gap and over a decade of Tory cuts on the most vulnerable. And we are now in the teeth of a global pandemic where evidence from esteemed academics, who and others are saying that the most vulnerable are likely to feel the impacts. So I'm always looking to see what else that can be done, to be fair.
Okay. And shortly after you took up post in late August 2020, the executive was informed that there had been a rapid increase in transmission of COVID, particularly among young people, and there were smaller clusters occurring over a wider area. And that increase in transmission continued really steadily from that point until winter. Do you agree?
I do.
And in your statement, you indicate that you've considered whether what happened from August 2020 onwards demonstrates that restrictions had been eased too quickly or without adequate planning across the summer, and you indicate that you don't believe that it did. And I just wanted to ask you why you thought that.
So, I mean, I think there were several factors. I mean, over the summer, there was a belief that the restrictions and easements, you know, would have actually been more effective because people would have been outdoors. So that was the issue or the concern, and I suppose even the hope. But I mean, and I don't know if you're going to touch on the modelling or whatever, but the scientific and medical advice that we've received for us was always the best guide. We also listened anecdotally and tried to get underneath the skin of that as well. So I understand there may be many reasons for it, but certainly some of the restrictions possibly been lifted early may have been a contributory factor.
Okay, and at the meeting, just jumping slightly ahead in the chronology, at the meeting of the Executive on the 1st of October, the First Minister suggested that an appropriate point had been reached to consider and implement a reset of the Executive's approach to the management of the pandemic. And in your statement, you indicate that you were supportive of that
That's
reset.
correct.
Can you explain what the rationale for that reset was, why you were supportive of it, and what it looked like in practice?
Because I first of all think that the reset wasn't that ambitious, to be frank. It was a stock take. It was, let's look to see where we are, what is working well, what is not working so well, what we need to do better off. So I think it was completely appropriate that we do that. And I was in favour of a reset simply because, and I have listened to others who have said this, I think the pandemic was having an impact, certainly on families, in terms of mental health, not having access to the same money despite all the mitigations that were put in place. If you're trying to educate your children at home, there was a lot of other external pressures in addition to the pandemic. And they were coming at every minister. Every minister was getting something similar, and indeed we were getting the feedback from the different fora and groups that were working with us all as partners. So I just felt it felt right to do a reset at that time.
And what changed after the reset in terms of the Executive's approach? Was it essentially a stock take rather than...
It was more of a stock take.
Okay. Now, moving on then to the Executive meeting on the 8th of October. And you might remember this one. This is the one where the CMO is reported in the minutes to have said, "Never more concerned as CMO than I am now. Short window of opportunity, sooner rather than later. Intervention now to avoid situation in 2 or 3 weeks." The handwritten note of that meeting then records you as having stated, "Evidence clear. If don't get or below 7, and I think that should be 0.7,
Yes.
huge diffs need intervention."
Yes.
And you go on to say that you were looking to see how you could help sport, etc. Don't point out what people already know, bring proposals to help. Now, in your statement, you contextualised that a bit more, and you said that you were alarmed at that point by what you were hearing from the CMO at that point. What action did you consider was necessary at that stage?
So there was no recommendation that came. So for the CMO, and obviously he can quite ably explain this himself, but despite differences, we did work in a collegiate way, and every minister, in my opinion, did their very best. And the Executive was the right place to air any differences in approach or differences in emphasis. But for the CMO to come to an Executive meeting and to say that he was never more alarmed in his role as CMO, without paraphrasing, and then not to offer advice or recommendation, I just couldn't understand the logic of it at all, to be frank, and I'm sure it wasn't on my own. Well, I'd be shocked if it was on my own and thinking that way.
And in the meeting, you're also reported to have said that you were looking to see how you could help sport. Were vulnerable groups and communities at risk on your radar at that time?
Yes, there were. So without getting into a whole context of it, so I during that, I lived on the New Lodge Road, BT15, one of the most deprived wards on these islands. And I was aware, growing up my whole life, the power of sports that had in keeping young people safe, kept them out of conflict, but in latter years, it kept them alive. Particularly the GAA, particularly young men, boxing and other sports. And when there wasn't the same access to crowds or groups or meetings, and I know a lot of the clubs done their meetings outside, I seen the power of bringing, not only keeping the young people safe who were already engaged in sport, but getting other young people to a meeting or to an event through sport, because I believe that they offered positive role models, and it was like the obvious thing for me to offer, and arts and culture was the same.
Ms Nichollen, if I could stop you there. In the context of a meeting where the Chief Medical Officer has said that he is never more concerned than he is now, might it seem a bit incongruous to focus perhaps on sports without suggesting that they aren't important for the reasons that you've suggested? But we're vulnerable communities. For example, I think we've touched on older people, the disabled, and those groups that really form part of your strategic responsibility.
No, so when you put it like that, it seems, sports just has come out of nowhere. I mean, there was a focus prior to that on young people. And my concern was, so obviously it's not reflected, it's not fully reflected, and I accept that. But when, evidence, and albeit physical or anecdotal evidence, says that children and young people particularly aren't listening to messaging, or there's a perception that they are infected more, the rate with children and young people is infection more, that was by way of an offering that this is probably a positive role model. It's not to diminish what older people were facing, or disabled people were facing, or women who were living in abusive relationships were facing. So I just want to put that on the record, to be honest.
And did the department at any stage undertake any work to identify and assess the impacts of the non-pharmaceutical interventions, for example, on the groups that you've just mentioned, on those specific groups?
So I can't remember it in my time. I think we were just getting through as best we could. I believe, other than getting the information back about what was working and what other interventions were needed, other interventions that would actually help keep people safe. I was also aware that probably somewhere down the line, the arm's length bodies that Deirdre and I work with in our department, which looked at libraries, museums, sports, arts, that was perhaps something that we could do collectively, again using the co-design and co-production model, and working with the partners that, to be frank, they were the first responders. These people were the first responders getting into communities with food boxes when everyone else was afraid. So it would be completely offensive to ignore them. So.
And Ms Nichollen, then on the 13th of October, the Executive agreed a 4-week circuit breaker to commence on the 16th of October. In your statement, you said that you consider that that decision was correct, but you suggest that it could have been taken earlier. Is that right?
Yes, well, given what the CMO said on the 8th of October, and the restrictions were being brought in on the 16th, there's a gap. So for that reason, it could have been brought in earlier. But as I said earlier, that meeting didn't come with a recommendation. It came with a very strong alarming statement, and that's all it was delivered, to be frank.
Okay, and that's something we can explore with
I'm sure you will. Yeah.
Now, that takes us up to the Executive meeting on the 9th of November 2020. And the proposal from the Minister of Health at that meeting was that the existing restrictions, which had been agreed on the 16th of October and were due to expire on the 12th of November, would be extended for a further 2 weeks. Did you agree with that proposal?
I did.
Now, we know that that meeting adjourned and reconvened several times across a number of days. It seems there was considerable difficulty in reaching agreement on the proposal. And I want to ask you this, why was that proposal so controversial?
I can't answer that. I think you're going to have to ask. I'm sure, I know you had Peter Weir in earlier, and I didn't see all of Diane Dodds's evidence, but I didn't find a further 2-week extension to keep people safe controversial at all. And so I can't answer why they felt it was controversial. What I can say, and I've said it in my statement, in my experience, the DUP were concerned about the imposition of restrictions around this period, and certainly the first to try and get them lifted. And while we understand that, because as I said to you previously, people were getting it hard financially as well as physically. But at the same time, I would not describe asking for a further 2 weeks as controversial at all.
Now, I won't open the minutes or the handwritten note, rather, of that meeting, but we know that it seems to have deteriorated as the days went on. Can you describe the tone of that meeting and explaining what brought it to an apparent breaking point?
It was the first time that the cross-community vote was used. Previous to that, in my experience, previous to that, any votes that were taken were done on a majority basis. You also had, and Nevin Poots can talk for himself, but you certainly, and I don't know if Diane Dodds was asked these questions or not, so forgive me, but certainly at times it felt like it was lives and livelihoods were seen as two separate issues, competing issues, when it was all collective. And the attitude about the scientific and medical advice that was given, I felt at times was, while people are free to disagree, and we did throughout this, I just felt that it was being disregarded. I would have dealt with that like any other meeting, because those meetings need to be robust. Unfortunately, they were leaked at times and people had their guards up. But when the cross-community vote was called for, I just felt it was a complete inappropriate use of a mechanism that was brought in as part of the Good Friday Agreement to protect minority rights, equalities and human rights. And I could not, and still don't, understand why that was called in.
Okay, Ms McKillen, and just to explore that a little further, from the face of the handwritten notes of that meeting, it seems that you said very little. Why was that the case?
Sometimes the less said, the better, to be frank. Don't be thinking that because I wasn't on the record as not having said anything that I wasn't concerned, or that I wasn't disappointed, or that I wasn't upset at the use of the vote. I just feel, and you will see throughout the notes, for all ministers, throughout the executive meetings, that people normally speak to a paper or speak to an issue. I just felt it would have brought no further benefit other than, you know, what you see already in the handwritten notes.
And Ms McKillen, you've indicated that you felt, I think you said, disappointed and upset, and that you had concerns. Would it not have been important for you as the Minister for Communities to communicate that in that meeting?
Well, let me also say that Michelle O'Neill, who was the Deputy First Minister, chaired that meeting over a period of days. Michelle O'Neill and indeed all other ministers who spoke, but certainly from our party, articulated what needed to happen rather than going down what we needed. I couldn't understand why you had to explain the need for an additional 2 weeks, particularly when we were going into a surge.
I think we'll leave that there, Ms. Traynor. I think it's very political territory, and I think we probably had enough.
Understood, my lady. Just one final question on that meeting, Ms. McKillen. We do see you have an exchange with the Chief Medical Officer at an early stage in that meeting, and the handwritten note of the meeting records the Deputy First Minister as having asked the Chief Medical Officer about isolation figures. And he gives an answer, which I'll summarise. He says that this was a previous executive question where he shared information from England and Wales, Northern Ireland, probably the same as elsewhere. And from the note, you then appear to have been critical of the modelling. And you say you need robust modelling, public money, reasonable ask. When will we see this data? Asked 2 weeks ago, need more robustness than what I have seen, need clear info. What was your concern about the modelling at that time?
Well, that actually sounds very curt and rude. So it's just to say, I wasn't challenging the CMO. What I was challenging was that I didn't feel the experience of here in the north was reflected. So I believe it was almost a very centralist approach. Now, I had to prepare in my department the number potentially. Now, and obviously it wasn't down to a specific number, but in the general, get an idea of how many people may have or may need a COVID isolation payment, how many people are going to try and access discretionary support, which is a grant, not a loan, because Deirdre insisted that happened because they really needed it. How many, so things like that. So I wasn't, it does sound like I was being quite rude. I was basically saying I have asked for this before. I was conscious that I had to account for public money. I didn't assume that this money would be forever flowing. And I was anxious, to be more honest, I was more anxious than critical. And I also was concerned that the experiences here, given the history of poverty and deprivation and discrimination and the impacts that had, were not reflected in any modelling going forward in the future. So.
Thank you for that, Ms. Nicola. I certainly wasn't suggesting that you were being rude.
No, I accept that, but when you read it out, I even feel it sounded a bit curt, and that's not us.
And finally then, Ms. Nicola, in your view, did the meeting of the 9th of November have any impact on executive relations thereafter? And if so, what was the impact?
Well, I think there certainly wasn't the same confidence coming from others, well, from the DUP or Bevan Pouts about scientific and medical advice then, so that was worrying. I also think that the use of the cross-community vote over something that I felt should have been a natural instinct for us to do, and that worried me. So, and I believe that we all were concerned about how we were going to try and get the mitigations and the support to people as best we could, and at the same time knowing that the funds aren't going to be here all the time. So I do think it was an amalgamation of things, and I think anyone to go to chair and to go through a 3-day meeting, it does have an impact. Now, I'm not saying, it was forever lasting, but it did impact.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Nicola. My lady, I have no further questions.
It's Ms. Campbell.
Thank you, my lady. And my question, in fact, is for you, Minister Nicolan. And it's really picking up on some of the themes of the evidence that you've just given about the impact of decisions. Can I take you back to June 2020? Mm-hmm. Because we know and you know that just 2 weeks after you took over in post as Minister for Communities, you chose to attend the very high-profile funeral of Mr. Story. And you deal with it in your statement, and perhaps we can have a look at the way in which you address it. It's at paragraph 209. Thank you. I'm grateful to the technical staff. You were asked by the inquiry whether public confidence in the executive's decision-making was impacted by breaches of rules and standards by public figures in the North or in Britain. And you believe that this did impact on public confidence, and you go on to say that you attended the funeral of your dear friend Bobby Story in a personal capacity, and they accept that by doing so you caused hurt to families who lost loved ones during the pandemic, and you apologise for that. Ms Nicholan, by the time that you took over as Communities Minister in June 2020, you and everyone will have been only too aware that the Executive had imposed previously unthinkable restrictions on our community, and that those restrictions had required a great many people to make very painful sacrifices, particularly around the attendance at funerals of parents, of children, of partners, or, as you put it, of dear, dear friends. Rather than just hurt, can you see the impact that that had on our community in terms of anger and resentment towards our publicly elected representatives?
I can, Ms Campbell, and I just want to take the opportunity again to apologise to the families who lost a loved one. I am very sorry. I absolutely do see the impact. And I also recognise that people were more than angry. So I accept that. And I really am sorry.
But do you accept also, though, that it's not a matter of hindsight looking back on the impact? That attending such a public funeral in those circumstances as a representative of our community, the consequences of that must have been foreseen by you in your decision to attend?
I think that's a fair point.
And not only, Ms Nicholan, did you attend, but in order to get to the funeral, you used your ministerial car. That's a point that you have laterally accepted, I think, in the summer of 2020. You accepted that you did use your ministerial car.
I did, and I reimbursed the department for its use.
But the decision to attend a funeral at all, but in fact the decision to attend a funeral in a ministerial car, surely you can see and could have seen that that will have contributed to a sense of disillusionment with our community.
So I accept what you're saying. I had business in the Assembly straight after the funeral. So I had to go to the Assembly and bring in regulations that afternoon. I accept I should not have wanted a funeral in a ministerial car.
Well, is it further than that? Do you accept that you should not have gone to the funeral at all, given your role as a Minister for our communities?
I can see the hurt and the anger, and I accept that now. Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Campbell. I think we have some questions remotely. Mr Stern, have you got a link?
Thank you, my lady.
We have.
Thank you, my lady. Ms Hargy, Ms Nicholan, can I check whether you can see and hear me clearly?
Yes.
We can.
Thank you. I ask questions on behalf of Disability Action Northern Ireland. Disability Action Northern Ireland is a disabled people's organisation. That is an organisation run by and for disabled people. I have two topics I want to ask you about. The questions are directed at both of you. First, engagement with disabled people's organisations. And second, DFC's disability strategy. So turning first to that first topic, Ms Hargy, you gave evidence earlier this afternoon about the Voluntary and Community Sector Emergency Leadership Group, the ELG. And you mentioned in your evidence the fact that Disability Action Northern Ireland hasn't been represented on that group. Now, given that the DFC is nominally responsible for social inclusion policy, including for disabled people, why did the membership of the ELG not include any disabled people's organisation representation when it was initiated in March 2020?
Well, I think I explained at the start in terms of the emergency leadership group. When I came into the department and we were hit with the pandemic, I did try to widen that group to make sure that it was more representative of communities on the ground so that we could have that direct impact fed in to the department. I also wanted to make sure that it was representative of those key areas of work where there would be vulnerabilities within the community. So there were two groups that cover those with disabilities that were involved in the emergency leadership group, as I say, the Now project that works with people with disabilities. It's a social enterprise, and also Inspire Wellbeing in terms of that. But I also accept in reading Disability Action's document, in looking at the concerns and the lived experience of those with disabilities and the impact that the pandemic had, should Disability Action as a group in its own right have been there? I would say yes, they would. And I added to that in terms of developing then the disability strategy, we did learn, really right away from the pandemic, even in terms of the role of women. There were women on the group, but maybe not from the women's sector. And we rectified that issue also. But I think in moving with the inclusion strategies around disability then, I did take a decision within the department that those strategies should be co-designed with the sector, with the communities on the ground to look at the direct impact. I had met with those sectors and with representatives from the community and those with disabilities as well. Now, it was on a Zoom call because of the pandemic, to talk to them in terms of the direct impact. And what we also done was, as we were developing the emergency response going forward, we learned from that as well early on. So one of the programmes in terms of where we knitted in to ensure that we included disability was the Job Start scheme. So looking at employment issues for young people within the labour market in and around the pandemic. And the Job Start scheme, this ran across England, Scotland, Wales and here. We slightly delayed the introduction of the scheme here because we included a specific focus on looking at disability in work, because we recognised that that was a gap in terms of some of the initial analysis that was coming through. And one step further to that did lead further on into the pandemic. We had the Harkin Summit then. It's an internationally renowned disability summit looking at the connection between disability and work. And the Department for Communities sponsored that summit to come to Belfast. And again, we worked collaboratively. We actually co-designed that summit with the sector. So I recognise in the early start of the pandemic where we were moving at pace, we wanted to get support out on the ground. I tried to be as inclusive as I could, but I recognised there were gaps in that. We acknowledged that, and we have since tried to rectify that with department work going forward. And I think also the issue of data, because I think it came up, in earlier questions, that is a broader issue, I think, in learning coming out of the pandemic as well, and how data is collected across government and how it's disaggregated in terms of disability or gender. I think there's definitely a gap there and more work to be done in the time ahead.
Ms. Hagi, a moment ago you mentioned the Now Group. Can I just confirm it's right, isn't it, that the Now Group, that's a social enterprise supporting learning disabled people into employment, but that's not a disabled-led organisation, is it?
It is a social enterprise group, but it works with those with disabilities. We also worked with Inspire. We also worked with the Older People's Commissioner and the Children's Commissioner as well. But I do accept that we should have had Disability Action on as a key organisation that, more broadly works on behalf of the sector. I mean, I did read the report in terms of the early interviews that were done with people with disabilities, and I completely accept the plight and some of the impediments that they faced. And I do think as a department, I accept that now that they should have been involved. I think we worked to rectify that in that all future work the department done. We did include organisations such as Disability Action and others in co-design and responses to programmes of work that the department are leading on.
I'm grateful, Ms. Hagi. Second topic now. It's the disability strategy. Now, on the 24th of September 2020, the DFC announced that work would commence on the development of a suite of new social inclusion strategies, and that was to include the disability strategy.
That's right.
Now, the projected launch date of that strategy remains publicly advertised as December 2021 on the DFC website. Now, entirely appreciating that neither of you are in ministerial posts at the DFC now, can you assist the inquiry as to why that strategy has still not been published?
Yes, well, I can cover that for all the inclusion strategies: disability, gender, sexual orientation and poverty, which intersections with the COVID inquiry. They are cross-departmental, they're executive policies, so even though the Department for Communities are leading on the development of those, they need cross-executive approval, and because the executive came down in February 2022, we then couldn't bring those policies to the executive to be approved. Now, with the Assembly up and running and with an executive now in place, I would be confident that the new minister in the Department for Communities will bring those forward. There were also delays in the devisement of the strategies in terms of when we would have liked to see them completed. Obviously, COVID had an impact because the department's energy then focused on mitigating the worst effects of the pandemic, but also because we took a deliberate approach to co-design these policies with the sectors, and that took more time in order to facilitate those discussions. We, I suppose, engaged with all of the sectors, including the disability sector, and that was something that they agreed to. I know I had done a direct meeting with those that were involved in the co-design of the disability strategy, because I also recognise that disability legislation here is way out of date. I think that's part of the lessons learned in terms of the implications, and we worked with them in terms of that co-design approach. But it was because there was no executive, the policy couldn't progress, and I'm confident that that will be an area of priority for the new executive that has just been formed.
Thank you very much. I think we'll have to leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lady.
Thank you both very much indeed. I hope you didn't mind doing jointly, but it did seem to be a good idea, given you had the continuity between you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll be back at 10 o'clock tomorrow.